It's the Romans. Yo, it's the Patriot game. Yo, that's the war racket. It's the war racket.
Thank you for tuning in to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, October 6, 2022, and we're streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. I'm Mary Massey with co-host John SAKOWICZ. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to our listeners listening to the broadcast in our broadcast area, and to those listeners listening throughout all of California and the country on listening to the live web stream here at kmud.org.
This program and all programs will be archived here at kmud.org and our program website, heroespatriots.org, and we have a Facebook presence, so we encourage you to look at that up. We invite you as listeners to call in with questions for our guests today, 707-923-3911. Our show engineer this morning is Dorothy, our faithful engineer, and we thank her for all her efforts. And just a reminder, if you made a pledge during the last week or so to become a member at KMUD, we hope that you will send in your pledge, right, John?
Absolutely, and Dorothy is also our membership director, I think.
Right, correct. So we hope you'll take care of that housekeeping business. We have two guests today, and very different topics. The first topic we're going to be speaking about the cost of being taken care of, medicine, with our guest, Dr. Steffie Woolhandler. She makes her first appearance with us. She came to Hunter College in 2010 after serving as a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. She's currently a distinguished professor at Hunter College. In addition to her duties at Hunter, she continues to collaborate with research colleagues at Harvard, where she is a part-time lecturer in medicine. She is currently co-chairing with Dr. David Himmelstein the Lancet Commission on Public Policy and Health in the U.S. And so we welcome Dr. Woolhandler to the program. Are you with us, Steffie?
Yes, I am.
Good morning, and thank you for being with us. This is your first time joining us. John?
Yeah, actually, Dr. Woolhandler has been on my show in the past at KZYX and at KMEC and other radio stations, and she's a fabulous guest. She and her partner David Himmelstein have been fighting for health care for all their entire careers. And if there are two people who can lay claim to largely influencing Obamacare and the other health care for all fights out there, it's Steffie Woolhandler and David Himmelstein. So I'm honored to have you back, Doctor.
So let's begin with your take on how healthcare has changed, perhaps, maybe even since COVID, with respect to rising costs. Your research has been showing that those who have major debt from medical procedures and chronic conditions don't fare as well as those who don't have medical debt. Could you speak to that?
Okay. Well, what has happened in my practice lifetime that's been going on for decades is that we used to just worry about people being completely uninsured, people who had no insurance. And we felt, if you had insurance, you were pretty much okay. But more recently, we've faced a problem we call underinsurance or partial coverage. You have some insurance, but you still can't afford care. And that has become a bigger and bigger problem over time. It's actually a big problem with the Affordable Care Act because the plans that you buy on the exchange, the metal plans, gold, silver, bronze plans on the exchanges, also called marketplaces, those come with huge deductibles and often very high co-payments. So private insurance plans are allowed to charge you almost $11,000 a year in co-payments and deductibles. And for many people, it might as well be $11 million a year if you don't have $11,000 you're really out of luck. So that is the reason, because of underinsurance, that's the primary reason why people end up with medical debt. Of course, if you still have no insurance, you're going to end up with debt. But many, many people have insurance, often private insurance that they purchased in good faith. And then when they get sick, they find they're not protected. They have co-payments, they have deductibles, they have out-of-network charges, they have uncovered services. So, they have insurance, they get sick, they try to use their insurance, and they end up, they find themselves with thousands of dollars in debt. Now, this is not a rare scenario. We analyzed in our recent study in JAMA Network Open, we analyzed Census Bureau data on tens of thousands of American households, followed for up to 3 years. And we found that nearly 1 in 5 U.S. households is struggling with medical debt. And many of those households, in fact, had insurance and ended up with debt anyway.
Dr. Woolhandler, we've seen a lot of commercials on TV lately for pushing medical advantage. They featured the likes of William Shatner and George Foreman, Jimmy Walker, Joe Namath. They all tout, quote unquote, free health care plans and offering enticing benefits like dental care that are not available from the original Medicare, also called traditional Medicare. What is the truth about these medical advantage TV commercials?
Okay. Well, Medicare Advantage is, these are private insurance plans that are available to Medicare beneficiaries, and the taxpayers pay most of the premium, right? Just like the taxpayers would pay for your care under traditional Medicare. With these private plans, the taxpayers pay the premium. The major problem with Medicare Advantage is it's cheating the taxpayers, and it tends to raise the cost. The cost to the taxpayers for Medicare Advantage is actually higher than taking care of the same patient under traditional Medicare. So from a overall point of view, we're seeing costs of Medicare go up, and that becomes a problem for not just the taxpayers but seniors as well, because if Medicare is getting more and more expensive, it's going to be a whole lot harder for the federal government to, provide better benefits under Medicare over the long run, provide things like dental care and vision care and hearing care, like many senators and congressmen are trying to get, and they face this issue, the costs are still going up so fast. It turns out Medicare Advantage is a big reason why the costs have been going up so fast in traditional Medicare, because of the kind of cheating that the private insurance companies do within the Medicare Advantage program. In terms of being an enrollee and, making a decision if you're over 65 and you're eligible for Medicare, often the Medicare Advantage plans give you a pretty good deal if you don't get very sick. If you're basically a pretty healthy person who doesn't use a lot of care, the Medicare Advantage gives you a good deal, and, often they throw in eyeglasses or a little bit of dental care, not much, okay, but, free eyeglasses, a little bit lower co-payments. The problem is if you are really sick, if you get a serious and rare cancer, if you require nursing home care, you require a lot of home care, then you're no longer helping Medicare Advantage private insurance company make money, and they really stick it to you. They charge you high co-payments and deductibles. They make it hard for you to make arrangements to get the expensive care you need. And we do see that when people get expensively ill, the Medicare Advantage stops working for them and becomes a real problem for sick people. So Medicare Advantage is really about the private insurance industry getting the taxpayers to pay these big premiums for them to support their profit making. It's not a very good strategy for the taxpayers or for the patients in the long run.
It seems like Congress should be stepping in. We were talking with Richard Eisenberg at Forbes magazine in preparation for the show, and I was shocked to learn that 42% of all Medicare plans are Medicare Advantage. Does that size up with your research as well?
Yeah, well, what has been happening is the insurance industry has been lobbying Congress, they've been lobbying the executive branch, and they've really captured the regulators within Medicare. Medicare is supposed to be regulating Medicare Advantage and making sure the taxpayers and the patients get a good deal. But we've seen the tremendous lobbying of the private insurance industry. They've managed to get themselves, huge increases in the amount of in the premiums that the taxpayers are handing over to Medicare Advantage. They've managed to, wiggle out the effort to regulate their abusive behaviors toward, the very sick people who they don't want to have in their plan anymore. So we have seen a giant expansion in Medicare Advantage. It's been very expensive to the Medicare program, very expensive to the taxpayers, and is moving us toward a totally privatized Medicare system that's no longer run as a public service, but is being run as a for-profit program.
I think our listeners need to hear that. Let's talk about the dark side of medical debt. You found that, again, this is an article that was in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA. So this is an important article in the country's most important medical journal. You and Dr. Himmelstein found that 18% of all households have some medical debt. And you also learned that medical debt plays out in terms of health outcomes, that you have worsening health outcomes the higher the debt, you have more food insecurity, you have the inability to pay for housing and utilities, you face eviction or foreclosure. All this plays out in health outcomes. Would you please elaborate?
Yes. Well, it's gotten very trendy within the medical community to talk about something we call social determinants of health, which is a very fancy name for living conditions that can make you sick or keep you healthy, right? So there's a lot of interest now in the role of living conditions, like having nutritious food, like having secure, safe housing, like being able to heat or cool your home, to pay your electricity bills, to pay your water bills, right? All of these things obviously have a very big influence on your health and your ultimate health outcomes. It turns out that when people go into medical debt, they become much more likely to become hungry, to become food insecure, much more likely to say, I can't pay my mortgage, I can't pay my rent, I can't pay my utilities, much more likely to lose a home, lose the roof over their head because of eviction and foreclosure. In fact, all of those problems were 2 to 3 times as common in people in the time that they, in the time right after acquiring a medical debt. Because our data was longitudinal, that means we were able to follow people over time, we could see the time sequence on this, and people would be going along, doing just fine. They would get sick, incur a medical debt, and then they would become food insecure, unable to pay rent or mortgage or utilities, evicted or foreclosed in the wake of being sick and acquiring medical debt. And medical debt was just as common in people who had private insurance as it was in the overall population. So having private insurance is no longer protective against medical debt. It's better than having no insurance at all. Any insurance is better than no insurance. But in terms of medical debt, private insurance was, it was not particularly protective. So the problem is that the patients can enter a vicious cycle where they get sick, they try to recover, but they have such a huge medical bill that they can't afford food, they can't afford housing, they may end up on the street. That makes them sicker. They end up with a bigger medical bill, and they become less able to afford food and housing. And you end up in a vicious cycle, that spirals down, basically spins and spins and spins until the person finds that their health is ruined and their finances are ruined. So this is completely unnecessary and does not happen in many other developed countries. If you get sick in Canada, There are no co-payments, no deductibles for doctor care or hospital care. It's covered, and you don't have to take a penny out of your own pocket. And recently, Canada has committed to adding pharmacare as well, so that the drugs you need will all be free as well.
Wow.
So other countries have figured out how to do this. If you get sick, you get the care you need, and then you worry about recovering without having to worry about paying the bills. Most countries in Western Europe have some form of national health insurance that protects people from medical debt. I've worked in the past on issues of medical bankruptcy, and there's a story that journalist T.R. Reid tells about interviewing the health ministers of other nations and asking them, what about medical bankruptcy in your country? And the health ministers in other nations don't even know what he's talking about, because medical bankruptcy doesn't occur in countries with good national health insurance. It is an American phenomena, and as we demonstrated in our past work with Elizabeth Warren, now Senator Elizabeth Warren, but at the time she was my colleague at Harvard, more than half of all personal bankruptcies in the United States are due, at least in part, to medical illness or medical bills. So we have a medical bankruptcy problem in this country. We have a medical debt problem that is making people go hungry and live in unsafe housing or lose their housing altogether, making them even sicker. And all of this is completely unnecessary, because what we need is a kind of national health program that people in Canada, most of Western Europe, have.
So, Dr. Woolhandler, we have a phone call. If you're willing to accept that question call, if you're listening, go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Woolhandler. My name is Dr. Patricia Rosenfield, and I've worked on some of these issues in the past looking at developing countries, but I really appreciate your underlying the role, the effect on taxpayers. And in other countries, it is paid for, especially in Western Europe, by high taxes and the right policy decisions, the socially oriented policy decisions on the part of legislatures. So I'd love to hear your perspective after your studies and important work on this subject about how do you think taxpayers in this country would be willing to pay higher taxes if they knew that the results would be comparable to the results in Canada and Western Europe? And what is the hope of legislators like Elizabeth Warren having any impact on changing the policy mix?
A couple good points and questions there. First of all, about 65% of all health care costs in the United States are already paid through taxes, if you include both direct tax-funded programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Administration, and also the health benefit costs of government workers like school teachers or FBI agents, and you consider the so-called tax subsidy to private health insurance, which is money lost to the Treasury because health benefits to workers are not taxable as like other compensation. So when you add all of those together, we're covering 2/3 of all health care costs in the United States already being paid by the taxpayers. And the shocking thing about that, when you translate that into dollars, is through our taxes, we are already paying more for tax-funded health care in the United States than the total cost of health care in Canada or Western Europe. Now, that's because healthcare costs are so much lower in Canada and Western Europe. But after we pay, $8,000 or $9,000 out of our taxes for healthcare in this country, we turn around and take several $1,000s more and hand it over to an insurance company as premiums or to hospitals and doctors as out-of-pocket payments. So we are already, through our taxes, paying for the full cost of a national health insurance in this country. We're just not getting it, okay?
Yeah, you bet we are. Our national debt only this week, surpassed $31 trillion. $31 trillion. What are we getting for that money? We're getting a war machine. We're getting all these illegal and immoral wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and every place, so many other places in the world. We're getting lobbyists and their clients paid off in any number of industries, including healthcare and big pharma. Do you care to comment on where that $31 trillion went, Dr. Woolhandler?
Yeah, well, some of it's going to healthcare. I mean, I support the idea of government funding healthcare. I think healthcare should be funded by taxes the way it is in Canada and Western Europe. But part of the advantage of funding healthcare through taxes is it makes it easier to contain healthcare costs. I'm not saying it makes it easy when all of the healthcare system is tax funded, but it's easier than the situation we have in the United States. And consequently, Canada spends about 12% of her GDP on healthcare. The U.S. is spending 19% of GDP on healthcare. So I think we should be paying for healthcare through taxes, and some people call it a single-payer Medicare for All program, and that would help control healthcare costs. In answer to the caller's question, to transition from where we are now to a single-payer Medicare for All system, we would have to, let's say, capture the money that employers and private households are now paying to private insurance companies and as out-of-pocket payments, and put that into the national health budget. And that is not an increase in the total cost at the household level. That's just a transfer of money that was being spent for private costs, like insurance premiums, out-of-pocket costs, and turning that into tax funding. So for the money we're now spending overall, we could get a really good national health insurance system. The average household would be paying no more than they're paying now, and co-payments and deductibles and uncovered services would be gone forever. And over the long run, the ability of a single public payer to control cost inflation would mean that health care was cheaper. We waste a tremendous amount of all of our health care spending on profits and overhead. So in other work we've published in New England Journal of Medicine and Annals of Internal Medicine, also in JAMA, we have found that a third of all health expenditure in the United States is just administrative costs, sending the bills, keeping track of things. And you have to compare that to the situation in countries like Scotland or Canada, where they spend only 1/6 of their total health care spending on administrative costs. So the difference between what we're spending on administrative costs and what we would spend with, say, a Canadian-style system is about $600 billion per year. And $600 billion is a lot of money, even in healthcare. And by getting rid of that administrative
Your Lancet Commission on Public Policy and Health in the U.S., is that, could you briefly describe what you do? We have about 4 more minutes with you, and we want to talk about what can be done, what is practical, and so forth.
Okay. Well, I think the one major recommendation was moving to a single-payer national health insurance system to save that administrative waste and devote it to patient care, and that is something the Commission has advocated. We've also advocated much fairer policies toward immigrants, ending racial discrimination in healthcare and in the rest of the society, equal rights for women. And we talked very specifically about what kinds of federal and state policies would be needed to achieve those goals. So we have published a large study. It was about half of one issue of the Lancet Medical Journal. We're planning on publishing an update soon. But we think a lot needs to change in the United States to ensure that the American people can afford care and that they stay healthy in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note what happened during the pandemic as well. And you and Dr. Himmelstein have done some important work in that area as well. You pointed out that in 2020, private insurer profits, largely from Medicare Advantage and Medicaid managed care, jumped 20 to 30%, even as full premiums were being collected, but less for care was being paid out. The healthcare insurance industry seems to be out of control.
They're totally out of control, and frankly, I don't think we need the private health insurance industry. Why do we need middlemen between the patients and the doctors, between the government that's picking up 2/3 of these total costs, and the doctors and hospitals? We do not need private insurance in the middle, but they've managed to insinuate yourself into that position, and they're so powerful that they're very hard to get out.
Thank you, Dr. Woolhandler. It's been a real honor to have you back on our program. And please give your partner and collaborator, Dr. Himmelstein, our regards as well, and hope to have you back soon.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure. Bye-bye.
You bet. So we have been speaking with Dr. Steffie Woolhandler. She is currently a distinguished professor at Hunter College. In addition to her duties at Hunter, she continues to collaborate with research colleagues at Harvard, and she is a part-time lecturer. She and Dr. Himmelstein are currently co-chairing the Lancet Commission on Public Policy and Health in the U.S., and they are leading advocates for healthcare justice and national health insurance for the United States. So we're going to take a brief pause now before we have our next guest on, Graylin Hagler. And it is 28 minutes past the hour. We thank you for joining us, and we'll be right back. So we are back. It's 29 minutes past the hour, and you are listening to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. As a reminder, you can hear our program the first and fifth Thursday of each month. We will be returning on November 3rd, I believe is the first Thursday next month. And we hope you will be joining us. So just a reminder again, if you pledged during the fund drive recently, please make sure that you honor that. John and I have renewed our membership, and we want you to also be a member. So we're going to continue with today's program by talking about something a little different. Most of us think of apartheid in the African nations, but today we're going to talk about it in Israel with our guest, Reverend Grayson Hagler. He is an African-American pastor and activist. He received his bachelor's degree at Oberlin College and his master's of divinity at Chicago Theological Seminary. Reverend Hagler served on the Steering and Administrative Committee of United for Peace and Justice, a national coalition working to oppose aspects of U.S. foreign policy that the group believes to contribute to war and aggression. He also led the Free South Africa movement to force divestiture of dollars from the support of the apartheid system. So we have Reverend Hagler on the line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. If you could just get a little closer to your microphone, that would help us out.
All right. I'm working at it as close as can be.
Okay, thank you. John?
Dr. Hagler, please tell our listeners what the apartheid is in Palestine. What is that apartheid?
Well, if you want to understand the apartheid in Palestine, just think of segregation in the United States. It's the same kind of dynamic where a particular group of people by race or by culture is devalued, exploited, basically diminished, and there's practices of genocide against them. Well, that's happened in the United States. Clearly, we like to forget it, but it still happens, and it is happening in terms of just look at the jails being filled with people of color, particularly black people. That is what apartheid is. Apartheid, a term that came out of the struggle in South Africa, but it was also though it came out of the struggle of South Africa, it really is a concept that basically applies to all kinds of racially and economically diminished and oppressed places around the world.
Right. And before we get into Israel, you have worked in South African nations to divest dollars, if you will, against apartheid. Could you update us on where that things are there?
Well, I mean, things in terms of South Africa, I mean, the big thing there was that a lot of the industry and the commerce did not change. A lot of the financial infrastructure did not change hands, even though people were basically given the vote. So
Right.
you don't have a radical economic change in South Africa, though you may have a political change to some degree. That's a part of the issue as well, is that you have to also struggle to have a voice and an ability to not only control the political apparatus as well as the economic apparatus, because one without the other basically does not end apartheid and the kind of existences that exist in terms of the discriminatory practices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, as John asked, the apartheid that's going on in Israel, between Israel and the Palestinians, how long has this been going on, and what is actually occurring?
Well, it has been going on really since the establishment of the so-called Jewish state in 1948. In 2016, I took a group of black preachers to Palestine, and as they landed on the ground and walked around, I kept hearing comments like, "This, it reminds me of where I came from in Louisiana. This reminds me of where I came from in Texas, from Mississippi." That's what the preachers were claiming. In what way? Because when they were looking around in terms of what was going on and how Palestinians were being discriminated against and treated, how they were second-class citizens, denied freedom of movement. You have to go through a checkpoint. Basically, your entire life is regulated by a whole system that separates Jewish Israelis from Palestinians. And so when you look at that and realize that that you don't have freedom of movement or economic mobility or political voice, and it comes down to the same thing that we had to fight against in the United States.
And in an apartheid where people are segregated by race or religion, it's not just about freedom of movement. It's also about the quality of education, quality of healthcare, quality of housing, quality of food security. Isn't that very different too?
Well, I mean, it is very much the same thing in terms of what exists. You got the two and three-tiered system. I mean, you are basically not being allowed to teach Palestinian history, for example. Just like, we had to focus on black history in order to begin to lift that up. So there's a whole lot of parallels in terms of the way people are being treated racially and ethnically in a place like Palestine or Israel. Israel is basically a European and American enterprise that has been constructed in the Middle East to disrupt the Middle East, to basically create a new marketplace for the West in the Middle East and continue to disrupt and control the aspirations of independence and sovereignty in the Middle East.
It seems like as if South African religious leaders like Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu get it. You get it. Are other American religious leaders getting it as well? And if not, why not?
Well, slowly people are getting it. But if you can imagine, it's just like if you say words like was said, that a progressive cannot support the apartheid of South Africa, and all of a sudden there's a hailstorm against you. It's a sign that people do not want the truth to be discussed, do not want to look at and be critical of Israel. Israel is sacrosanct in terms of U.S. perspective and the U.S. narrative. And so, in a sense, people have become afraid to speak out because of the kind of backlash. People have lost their jobs for speaking out. But that's also a sign that things are radically changing, and people realize that it's changing. They got to fight back and try to push people back because the perspective and the narrative is becoming unglued. People are raising the questions about the unholy alliance between the West and particularly the United States and Israel. People are raising the question of apartheid that's operating in South Africa. I mean, it's been said for a long time. I think that when you go to Ramallah, that's why you have a big statue of Nelson Mandela in front of the building in Ramallah, because they understand and they know that the South Africans understood their struggle and they understood the South African struggle. Why? Because it was the same struggle. And so there is this relationship. So the narrative is becoming undone. People need to engage and boycott divestment and sanctions. That means what we've been pushing for in terms of all across the country is the Palestinian civil society in saying that we will not buy products that come out of the occupation. We will not support businesses that come out of the occupation. And of course, people are trying to pass legislation to declare that to engage and to embrace boycott, divestment, and sanction is an anti-Semitic move. Well, that's ridiculous. And I don't buy into the whole argument about being anti-Semitic, because when you talk about being anti-Semitic, you're talking about a definition that comes out of Europe, that was used heavily in Europe to basically push and destroy the Jews in Europe by extermination. But the Holocaust that Jews had gone through is not any greater than the Holocaust that other groups have gone through, such as black people. My Holocaust, the Middle Passage, my Holocaust, 400 years of enslavement in the Americas. That continues even today.
Do you get pushback for that analogy and that comparison?
Say that again, please.
I said, do you get pushback for that comparison, the apartheid situation and the Holocaust?
All the time. But it doesn't mean that it's not, my analysis is not true. The fact is I did an article in Mona Weeks not too long ago where after Whoopi Goldberg said what she said, there was all that upstorm and pushback, and I basically argued that Whoopi Goldberg felt it, but she did not know how to articulate it, that when you look at what black folks have gone through, you begin to wonder, why is one narrative more important than the other narrative? I'm not saying that the Holocaust is not something that is traumatic and dangerous, and we need to remember it, but I'm saying that it is not the only Holocaust, because it has been used politically to basically create a pathway and a justification for Israel to do whatever Israel chooses to do in the Middle East, and particularly against other ethnic groups and Palestinians in the Middle East. But it cannot be used in that way, because you cannot use the idea of a Holocaust.
49 minutes past the hour. If you'd like to ask a question of our guest, the number to call, 707-923-3911. I wanted to ask about your work on the Committee of United for Peace and Justice. It is a national coalition to oppose aspects of U.S. foreign policy. Could you talk about that group and what you're currently working on?
Right. I'm no longer a part of that group. I'm no longer a part of that group. We came together we were prepared, as the U.S. was preparing to invade Iraq, and we began to organize to try to really oppose the kinds of aggressions that were taking place in Iraq and other places.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. John?
Yeah, Reverend Hagler, I really have to take my hat off to you. I'm usually not obsequious with guests. I don't have to be, but I have real admiration for you. You seem to be in the tradition of Martin Luther King, Dr. King, where you just don't take the pulpit and preach. You practice what you preach.
Yeah.
You're out there fighting for social justice. You're out there fighting for not just for justice for blacks here in the United States, but for oppressed peoples everywhere in all apartheid situations. I compare that to, say, the priest in my own church. Mediocre sermons. I have no idea what his politics are like. I don't think he cares one twit about politics. And I think if he did care about politics, he'd probably hear from the archdiocese. Why are there so few religious leaders who are politically active, I guess, is my question. People like you, people in the tradition of Martin Luther King.
Well, one of the things is that seminaries have divorced people from the the historical Jesus and have focused and trained people and tried to condition them only in the spiritual Jesus. There is a spiritual Jesus, but there's also a historical Jesus. And the historical Jesus was opposing political oppression, domination, colonialism, was fighting against the empire to try to free the land and free the people. And so if we begin to go back and examine the historical Jesus and we try to emulate that, then we cannot avoid but be out in the streets. And we cannot avoid being like Fannie Lou Hamer said, if anybody, the issue is that if nobody is free, I'm paraphrasing, I'm thinking it, but he talked about that everybody had to be free. And that's the thing, from the LGBTQIA community, the women, black people, the Latino people, the immigrants. The fact is that we need to basically broaden our scope and understand that we're called to embrace a human community, and particularly a community that is yearning to be free and empowered.
And what avenues are available to those who are listening, excuse me, who might want to stand up and put down apartheid?
Yeah, to stand with you.
Well, I think that there's groups in communities like Jewish Voice for Peace. That's one group that's out there.
Could you repeat that? You're kind of fading out.
Yeah, Jewish Voice for Peace is one group out there that's been doing some good work in terms of resisting Israeli apartheid and also resisting even police exchanges between the U.S. and Israel. And it's a group that continues to operate around the spirit of the liberation of Palestinian people. There's also Fellowship of Reconciliation, FOR, USA, that continues to work on these issues and many other issues of people being free around the world. There's a whole lot of mechanisms to get engaged and get involved. And I need to point out, because FOR, Fellowship of Reconciliation, is a group that came together in Europe as World War I was beginning. And that group became a pacifist group advocating for conscientious objection. And the USA group is a group that followed suit, was founded about a year later, and have been working to basically focus on the issues of peace, justice, disarmament, and really the removal of the conditions that create violence.
Reverend Hagler, we have a caller with a question for you. Caller, go ahead with your question.
Good morning. Can you hear me clearly?
If you could speak up, please. We can barely hear you.
Okay. So my question is, the apartheid that's being explained in Israel is sponsored solely by the tax dollars of the United States, which is basically a funnel of money from the Republican Party. I'd like to point out the work of Dr. William Barber, especially Moral Mondays. And I'd like to ask how the healthcare system in this country can be codified in a way that suits the needs of all of the people, as we see the tax rate not going up for the wealthy, but on the poor, who are impacted the most by health care. And then my second question would be to John. You're asking for moral leadership from ecumenical sources when the confidence of the populace is just about as low in ecumenical leaders as it is in our elected officials.
Good point.
Thank you for your program. I always enjoy listening to your vibrant topics.
Thank you, caller. Dr. Hagler, could you take that first part?
Well, I think that groups like, I think they actually write the Poor People's Campaign, a call for moral revival, led by Reverend Barber and Neil Thea Harris. It's a place, another way in place for people to get involved, to become engaged, because as they try to talk about the issue of the U.S. war economy and what needs to be restructured in terms of to create a balance of a society where the poor are lifted up, where there is justice. I mean, to talk about preservation of the earth and to, again, to offer a critical analysis of the monies that continue to go into war and basically deprive those who poor and those who are on the margins from things like basic human rights of health care, things like that. That's an important issue. I just want to say also, I think that the issue around the religious and ecumenical leadership, or the voice of that leadership, is we have been engaged in a battle. And I think we need to admit that we have been engaged in a battle. One of the things that got clear with Trump and the white evangelical movement is that many, many black people refer to themselves as evangelical preachers, as evangelical. Those black preachers stopped calling themselves evangelical because they weren't that, right? Because they weren't that. They did not subscribe to what was being advocated. They are not Christian nationalists. So there is continued movement. And one of the things that we need to recognize, because I think that the white church have a hard time becoming anything that is critical of the system with which it exists in. It's afraid to speak against it. It's afraid to challenge it. Whereas people of color, and particularly the black church, has had a long history that continues to challenge the system, to challenge the questions and the equations that the system come up with. And I think it's important that people realize that there is a continued resistance to the dominant culture that tends to be white, that tends to be Christian or Judeo-Christian, and continues to not question the system that it's part of. There's still a movement that challenges it.
Reverend Hagler, in Desmond Tutu, in his last published piece before his death, called on President Biden to acknowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal, writing, "There are few truths more critical to face than a nuclear weapons arsenal in the hands of an apartheid government." Now let's backtrack that a bit. Every U.S. administration has performed a perverse ritual as it has come into office, including the Biden administration. And that ritual is that they all agree to undermine U.S. law by signing secret letters stipulating that they will not acknowledge something that everyone knows, that Israel has a huge nuclear weapons arsenal. The effect is to give madmen, warmongers, the enforcers of apartheid, like Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's former prime minister, a sense of enormous power and impunity, allowing Israel to dictate terms in Palestine and in much of the Middle East. Talk to us a little bit about how that nuclear arsenal gives Israeli leaders just too much confidence, allows them to overstep their bounds, even to the extent that it creates an apartheid within its own government.
Yeah, but that's not accident. That's design. Because if you talk to Susan Abu Hawwa, who's the Palestinian novelist, but also a researcher, she points out that Israel is functioning as the largest arms dealer in the world. And it is offering military weaponry and implements to some of the most despotic leaders in the world. Weapons are tested there on the Palestinian population. When those weapons come down out of the sky upon demonstrators, unarmed Palestinian demonstrators, that's testing weapons that have been developed by the military-industrial complex, by the defense industry. So this is all by design that is there. So even though, everybody knows that South Africa has nuclear weapons, the fact is that it exists as a vehicle with which the West can, through Israel, supply arms to some of the powers that they want to keep in power, and basically Israel serves as a testing ground for the weaponry that is developed. I mean, where do you think the Iron Dome came from? Right. Those types of concepts. Those are things that were created, developed, and experimented with by the apartheid regime that we know as the State of Israel.
Right. And cluster bombs and white phosphorus and other weapons of mass destruction, other weapons that whose indiscriminate use causes widespread war crimes and crimes against humanity. I couldn't agree more. Another question for you. If Israel's per capita domestic product is comparable to that of Great Britain, why do we give them so much money? Why do we give them so much foreign aid? The U.S. taxpayer funds Israel exceed that to any other country. Adjusted for inflation, the publicly known amount over the years is over $300 billion. Why do we just hand money out to Israel?
Well, we got to remember that Israel is a satellite state of the United States. And if you go there and you realize who serves in the so-called defense forces, where they draw people from who have second homes there and all kinds of things, you realize that this is a beachhead for the U.S. and for European interests. And so the incentive is to keep them well-financed, a place in which you can do business, and a place in which you can experiment your own inadequacies, which are weapons on armed population.
You know, looking at this is a bit off of subject, but related to the nuclear idea, is that Russia is now possibly getting ready to release nuclear activity on Ukraine. Could you just kind of comment on that whole scenario, and what are your thoughts?
Well, you know, I mean, the thing is we think that most people in the U.S. think that they got a free press. We do not have a free press. You know, we want to malign the state press out of Russia, or the state press evil, or the state press out of Venezuela, but we have a state press that basically picks up a narrative, runs with it without questioning it at all. I mean, for example, if you look at Putin's comments are made around nuclear weapons in reference to a threat to invade Russia. I'm not defending it. I'm not defending Putin at all. But I'm saying you got to look at the entire context of what is said and how it is said. But it works towards beating the sabers of war when you can basically frame it in a particular way that reaches towards your end and also makes him the master villain over all the other villains. There's villains in Ukraine as well. I mean, you know, there's been a right-wing military in the Ukraine. You know, there's been discriminatory practices in the Ukraine that people of color could not get out and to stand in the back of the line as usual. I mean, all those types of things. I mean, so what I'm saying is that we have chosen a side as in terms of our politics, in terms of the political narrative that leads to the press, the so-called free press, carrying out that same narrative. Just think, we cheer Ukrainians in their resistance of Russians, but we condemn Palestinians when they resist occupation by Israelis and the bulldozer.
Good point. No, it's you know, again, you're saying the kinds of things that Martin Luther King would have said, Dr. King would have said. You're saying the kinds of things that the historical Jesus would have said. Nobody is saying these things. Nobody is saying these things out loud, and they're certainly not saying it from inside of churches, from pulpits. We have lost our faith in our political leaders, as you rightly point out, and we have lost our faith in ecumenical leaders. There is no moral leadership in this country. What can we do about it, Reverend Hagler?
Well, let me give you a quick story. When the war was beginning to happen in Iraq, I was preaching against the war from the pulpit about Iraq and about Bush and their push to go to war. And we organized a number of buses to go up to the march that took place in New York that I emceed up there. And what was interesting to me was that I had a number of senior citizens in my church that came to me and said, "Reverend, you know, I'm too old to get on a bus, but here I'm going to write you a check make sure somebody who can't afford to get on that bus get on that bus. We'll pay for all the buses from our seniors, black seniors in church who were concerned about war. Whereas I had another pastor friend at a predominantly white church that made the comment that we really need to examine the reasons for going to war. Wow. And they threatened to fire him. That's the difference in terms of this whole narrative that exists, white versus black. Because in a sense, we have always been, from the black community, the spirit of resistance.
Right.
And from the white community,
Reverend Hagler, we have 2 minutes before we sign off, but John has
I know. I want to jump in. Reverend Hagler, do you still preach? Because the next time I'm in Washington, D.C., I want to make my way to your church, the Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ. Do you still preach? Because I would love to hear you preach.
I stepped down 3 weeks ago.
Oh, man.
I stepped down.
Maybe I can have a private audience. God knows I need it.
We want to just take this last minute to thank you for your activism and your outspokenness and your heroism for all the things that you've done throughout the years, not only in Palestine, but in South Africa. And if folks want to follow your work or get in touch, what might they do?
They can get in touch with me at Faith Strategies at faithstrategies.org.
Okay.
My website, obviously, is faithstrategies.org. I'm listed as Grayson Hagler on Facebook and the same on Twitter. So you can get in touch with me through any of those methods.
Okay, faithstrategies.org and on Facebook and Twitter, Reverend Hagler. Is that correct?
Hagler, yep.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, we want to thank you for being with us on this such an important topic.
Yeah. Are your sermons, have they been recorded and are they cataloged and can we find them somewhere?
Yeah, you can find them. You can find them. You can even find them on YouTube. You can find them on our website, those types of things. Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Sir, I want to thank you so much for being a guest on our show again. I don't mean to go over the top, but you're in the finest tradition of religious leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King. You draw the fine distinction that needs to be made between the historical Jesus and the spiritual Jesus. I just can't wait to have you back on the show. You speak truth to power. You preach truth to power. Thank you so much, Reverend, for being a guest on our show.
Thank you for having me on. Take care.
You bet. So we have been talking to Reverend Grayson Hagler about apartheid in Palestine and other areas. And I want to remind folks that our next program is going to be the first Thursday in November. I believe it's the 3rd. So we hope you'll come back and listen in. We'll have another great guest. And we thank both our guests for being with us today.
Yeah, keep those memberships coming in. We depend on you to support this important community resource. Remember, KMUD is your community radio station. Thank you for listening to this program, and thank you for supporting your station.